Thanks very much, Cara. It's lovely to be part of a programme organised by my mother's hometown. We have a good, strong family connection with Listowel, always have done, so it's great to be back in town, so to speak. We're talking about the Kerry newspapers during the War of Independence, but I suppose what you really want to know before that is that Kerry has always been a hotbed of newspaper publication. And I always reckon it's because everyone in Kerry has an opinion and they're not shy about telling you. And when we look at 1916, there are 10 newspaper titles in Kerry during 1916. The stablemates among them, the Kerry Advocate and the Kerry Press, they were run by Maurice P. Ryle, who was a strong newspaper man always, and they ran from 1914 to 1916. They ran out of circulation in May, just after they reported on the executions of the 1916 leaders. The Kerry People would have been the third one in that particular stable, and Maurice Ryle, again, editor of that, but he actually stepped away from it while the other two were in circulation, and then came back once those two shut down. And the Kerry People ran, it was the longest running, we'll say, up to and during the War of Independence and into the Civil War as well. So it's quite an important piece of newspaper in that respect. The other Kerry stablemates, you had the Kerry News and the Kerry Weekly Reporter and the Killarney Echo and South Kerry Chronicle. They were, John Bustede Quinnell was the man who ran those newspapers, and the Kerry News came back after the War of Independence, but I'll come back to the tale of woe about those newspapers a bit later. The other stablemates we're talking about would have been Nolan's papers, the Kerryman, and its virtual Tralee edition, the Tralee Liberator. And the Liberator ran from 1914 to 1939, and we already know about the Kerryman. It's still on the go. And the other two newspapers of the time, the Kerry Evening Post, which had been around since 1774, but which actually had its last edition on September 29th, 1917, so didn't make it as far as the War of Independence. And similarly, the Kerry Sentinel, which would have been the Home Rule newspaper, that was run by the Harringtons, who were Home Rule MPs under John Redmond, and they gave up the ghost in 31st of August 1918. They carried on as a print works, but not as a newspaper publishing office. Now, when we get into the actual War of Independence itself, Salahead Beg is normally the point that people sort of say that's the starting point of the War of Independence. And from a Kerry point of view, Ryle Dwyer always claims that Gortaclay, the raid on the police vote in 1920, was actually the first proper action of the Civil War, but it is really an outlier. Salahead Beg is, I suppose, technically speaking, the time when it all started. But in terms of Kerry reportage of War of Independence events, there's nothing really happening in Kerry for a few months. So we have things like labour strikes happening in January 1919. What had begun as a strike of carters and vanmen in Tralee soon escalated into a general strike of all workers, with the exception of clerical staff, in Donovan's, Latchford's, McCowan's and Kelleher's. And the carters were striking for an increase of 6 shillings a week, from 34 shillings to 40 shillings. James Slattery and Sons and Tralee Urban Council and several other local traders had already arranged an increase of 3 shillings a week with their men, but these other guys were, again, looking for that bit more. The strike was already leading to suffering among the working classes for want of fuel and bread, and the Kerry Weekly Reporter predicted that matters would come to a serious crisis if some effort is not made to bring about a settlement within the next few days. And both it and the Kerry People noted that a load of coke, which was being carried in an urban council car from the gasworks to the technical school, was overturned by several women, and the fuel in it was distributed among them. It's like that scene in My Left Foot when Christie hijacks the coal lorry. Similarly, Dáil Éireann had its first meeting in January 1919 as well, and the Mansion House was certainly the place to be on Tuesday the 21st of January. During the morning, the whole of Grafton Street and the surrounding area had been bedecked with Union Jacks and the flags of the other World War I allies, and that would have seemed very incongruous to the people attending the first session of the new Dáil Éireann. The reason became clear when it was realised that during the early part of the day, the Mansion House had hosted an entertainment for prisoners of war repatriated from Germany. Now, at that first Dáil meeting, Cathal Brugha was proposed as chairman, and he led the meeting, which was conducted almost entirely through Irish. And following an opening prayer, a roll call was taken of all the newly elected representatives for Irish constituencies, including Irish Parliamentary Party MPs and Unionist MPs. Now, the Sinn Féin element of the roll call was largely answered with "in jail," when there were no replies when the Irish Parliamentary Party names were called out, while the call of Sir Edward Carson's name provoked a huge amount of laughter among the audience. Now, once a temporary constitution had been agreed and the Declaration of Independence read in English and French, and the programme for government read in English and Irish, and the Irish version was read by the Kerry East MP, Piers Beasley, the Dáil appointed its representatives to the post-war peace conference that was De Valera, Griffith and Count Plunkett. Now, this was despite the fact that Ireland wasn't even guaranteed a place at the conference. When we move on then to February 1919, and sorry, pardon me, I'm a bit slow on the uptake here. And again, there's very little happening in terms of political manoeuvrings, but quite importantly, the military start to get a hard time from the locals. At a meeting of the 4th of February 1919 of the Tralee Technical Instruction Committee, it was informed that the military authorities had placed a special fund at the Department of Education's disposal for payment to county committees who were conducting military classes. So the department would pay the class fees for soldiers and would award grants for those attending ordinary technical school classes. Now, Mr. Tom Dennehy raised the question of interference with ordinary classes through provision for the military, which the principal stated wasn't an issue, and after some further discussion, Dennehy proposed a resolution that the English Army of Occupation be excluded from technical school forthwith. And this was seconded by Councillor Tom Slattery. And it was passed by a motion by 3-2 at the committee. But a special meeting was called of the committee so that they had the sole purpose then of rescinding this anti-military resolution. Then he objected to the meeting on the grounds of insufficient notice having been given, but the chairman rejected this. He wanted to consider the issue as he deemed the resolution passed at the last meeting to be both irregular and illegal. Then he and Slattery prophesied friction in the school owing to the reintroduction of the military, and then he called it Prussianism to overturn the resolution of the last meeting, and said the chairman's actions would be detrimental to the interest of the schools. He said, if you overrule the decision of 9/10 of the people of Tralee, your schools will be catering for the military instead of the civilians. He further claimed that a complaint had been received from a parent of one of the technical school's pupils, but he didn't substantiate his claim. Student strikes and public meetings followed in protest at the presence of the military in the school. And until a meeting happened on the 3rd of September 1919, this all strikes going on all that time. And that meeting in September clarified the situation that would obtain for the coming school year. It said that the special classes for the military have ceased, and the situation at present is exactly the same as that which obtained on the 1st of January 1919. And the Republican element within the Technical Education Committee were soon fully in control, with the election of Dennehy as chairman. And to rub salt in the wounds of the military, a position of drill instructor, a 1 hour per week position, paying 8 shillings an hour, saw 3 candidates apply for the post. Sergeant H. Lowe of the Royal Munster Fusiliers, William Boyd, who was ex-South Irish Horse and the Royal Air Force, and William O'Connor, a tailor's apprentice from Pembroke Street. O'Connor got the job. He was unanimously appointed by the committee without any experience. When we move on to April 1919, sorry, being a bit of a pain in the ass. And a special crimes court. We're starting now to see some elements whereby the authorities are cracking down on individuals rather than on the party itself. And a special crimes court met in Tralee on the 31st of March to consider a case against Michael O'Brien of Church Street and Patrick Griffin of Market Street, Listowel. Where both men were charged with unlawful drilling at Listowel. This is volunteer drilling. On the 9th of March, on the occasion of the funeral of Pierce McCann, who was the Sinn Féin MP for Tipperary East. And he had died on the 6th of March 1919 after being interned in Gloucester Prison. A third man, Thomas O'Donoghue, was also subsequently indicted on a related charge. And once evidence had been heard, Magistrate Mr. Wynne asked O'Donoghue whether he had anything to say. O'Donoghue delivered a short address in Irish in which he consigned the court to his satanic majesty and referred to the whole proceedings as a farce. Mr. Wynne sentenced all three men to 3 months with hard labour in Cork prison. And Griffin responded that the best thing you can do is leave out the fellows inside. They're only making a laughing stock of the government. And on leaving the courthouse, the three men were cheered loudly to the 12:30 train for Cork. At the same time, you notice from the slide here, Dan Flavin and Patrick Fitzgibbon, they were both arrested for selling seditious literature, and by the end of the month, they were both in jail as well. And Sinn Féin endorsed proportional representation for future elections in Ireland, which is quite a seismic agreement on their part. We get into May. Pierce Beasley is arrested and he's charged with seditious speech and possession of seditious literature in Dublin. In reading the first charge against him, a quote from the speech he made at Edenderry was presented, and Beasley was reported to have said, "We have been sent down to assist the people of Rode and Edenderry in their fight for the Ballymacwilliam farm, which had been taken over and commandeered for military purposes. And when we came to Rode, the army of occupation was there before us, with trench helmets, rifles, bayonets, and motor lorries. We were informed that no meeting could be held, but instead of one, we held 3. This is the first attempt to plant British English soldiers, but it will not be a success. The message I have for the people of Edenderry and Rode is to stand together, and Dáil Éireann will stand by them and take the responsibility. We have so far come out on top. We beat the enemy at Lincoln Prison, and Austin Stack beat them in Belfast Jail. As regards McNellis, that affair was all right, as well as other little incidents. We are winning and will keep on winning until we drive the enemy, bag and baggage, out of the country." And the second charge relates to notes that were in his possession on the destruction of railways, telephone and telegraph wires, the disabling of locomotives, and notes on musketry instruction. And he had these in his possession when he was arrested at College Green on the 4th of March. The court decision was promulgated at a later date, and it notes that the Freeman's Journal notes that Beasley was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment without hard labour. When we move on to June of 1919, so we've seen the beginnings of police interference in public events. There's a baton charge at an Iriacht in Killarney, which is an outdoor Gaelic League entertainment. Castle Gregory Barracks is attacked and arrests are made, and those will come into sharper focus. Those will come into sharper focus when we get to August 1919, when their cases are brought before the courts. And again, the Kerry papers carried international news, and you're seeing here the first Atlantic flight accomplished by Alcock and Brown is reported at this time as well in Kerry People. When we get to July 1919, and we're seeing Cornelius O'Mahony, who was a native of Skibbereen, and for several editors, for years, he had been the editor of the Kerry Weekly Reporter and the Kerry News. At 9 a.m. on the 26th of July 1919, at his home in Widerwell, it was raided, and he was charged under the Defence of the Realm Act regulations with refusing to admit the police into the Tralee Theatre on the 25th of June, on the occasion of a lecture given by Sinn Féin organiser P.C. O'Mahony. The lecture was entitled "Republicanism and the Work Before Us." And in giving his judgment, Magistrate Wynne said, "I look upon this refusal to admit the police as serious. It is not only a direct challenge by Sinn Féin to the government authority, but it also means if the police carried out their orders and forced their way into the lecture, a serious breach of the peace might occur." He ordered that Cornelius O'Mahony enter into recognizances himself in £20 and 2 sureties of £10 each to keep the peace and be of good behaviour, or in default 3 months in jail. O'Mahony refused to enter recognizance and was removed to Cork jail for 3 months. The other headline we have here is to do with the 12th of July, and it's an editorial by Maurice Ryle in the Kerry People, in which he says, "The political sensation of the hour is the speech delivered by Sir Edward Carson in the North on the Orange 12th. For rank unadulterated sedition, it'll take a lot of beating. A similar speech, if made by a nationalist in the South or West, would result in immediate arrest and a long-term imprisonment," the way Pierce Beasley got it. But Sir Edward is to go scot-free. The law officers, we are informed in Parliament, do not consider that the speech supplies grounds for prosecution. The said law officers, it should be remembered, are members of Parliament for Orange constituencies in Ulster. Yet the pretense, the shockingly dishonest pretense, is kept up that impartial justice is administered in Ireland. And we'll come back to Maurice Ryle on other occasions as well, because he tends to be the most outspoken of the various newspaper editors in Kerry at the time. When we move on to August, on the 1st of August 1919, 5 men, Timothy and Michael Spillane of Carrigaha, Michael Flynn and Michael Griffin from Capanani, and Michael Monsell of Duwa, were placed on remand for the attempted murder of Sergeant Oates and Constable O'Connell near Castle Gregory on the 24th of June. These are the guys we spoke about when we were looking at this earlier on. District Inspector O'Connor of Dingle had requested a continuance of the remand of these guys owing to the unavailability of Sergeant Oates to testify against them. He was the guy who was injured by them when they raided Camp Barracks. Magistrate Mr. Wynne decided just to return them all for trial at the Munster Assizes when it happened in Cork in December 1919. And the outcome of their trial was a guilty verdict in all cases. Michael Spillane and Michael Flynn were given 18 months each. Michael Monsell was given 15 months. Michael Griffin was given 9 months, and Timothy Spillane, who was the shooter in this event, was given 3 years. Almost directly after the trial, Timothy Spillane was transferred to serve his sentence at Maryborough Prison, Port Leisha, to you and me. The others were all transferred to Mountjoy, where all 4 took part in the hunger strikes of early 1920. All 4 were granted early release in May 1920 due to their failing health brought about by the hunger strike. So Timothy Spillane was unlucky that he didn't get transferred to Mountjoy with the rest, or he would have been out in time. It's worth noting as well, again, it's another editorial about latitude that was given to ex-soldiers in Tralee. And you'll note here it says, on Saturday night last, an exhibition of blackguardism on the part of some soldiers was given on Castle Street, which calls for the strongest condemnation. The door of Messrs. Hiltzer's establishment was broken in, and though policemen were on the scene, not a finger was raised to prevent this wanton and wicked work. Why? Have the military carte blanche to do as they please in the town? Now, this may have been the case in Tralee, but by the time we get to the following month, down in Cahersiveen, things are a little bit different. And we note that following the Great War, a great many soldiers were left to their own devices. Sorry, I'm hearing a bit of crackle on the line there. But a great many soldiers had been left to their own devices to get on with lives that had been broken by the horrors they'd witnessed on the Western Front. There was no recognition of conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder or any of the other crippling psychological damage suffered by survivors. Many returning Irish soldiers also found themselves coming home to an Ireland that was radically changed since they left it, with acceptance of their sacrifice in short supply in many cases. And it's in this context that cases against deemed soldiers should be considered. And at Cahersiveen Petty Sessions, there were several of these in their September sitting. Constable Gibson summoned John Kelleher for drunkenness. Constable Gibson summoned John Sullivan of Fairfield for a similar offence. Constable Gibson also summoned Michael Sullivan of Top Street for drunkenness. Constable McLean summoned Michael Sullivan, the same man, on a second count of drunkenness. Constable Reid summoned Patrick Coffey of Top Street, Cahersiveen, for being drunk and disorderly on the public street. Now, cases like these and other cases for assault and criminal damage against demobbed soldiers were commonplace around the country in the 2 years following the end of the Great War. Now, September also saw the suppression of the Cork Examiner, suppression of Dáil Éireann, and of Quinnell's newspapers. Maurice Ryle was very curious about this. He said, personally, Mr. Quinnell is regarded as a unionist, but as a non-politician. He's a prominent member of the local Freemasons Lodge, and he also noted that 2 of Quinnell's sons had served in the Royal Flying Corps during the war. So he wondered what was the percentage in taking on someone like Quinnell, who was technically, as far as Maurice Ryle was concerned, was one of their own. When we get into October, this month, we saw a rash of attacks on creamery premises, and primarily those belonging to J.M. Slattery and Sons Limited. Ballinorick Creamery was burned, and an attempt was made to bomb Kilquan, Ballymakelligot Creamery. The indignation of the Kerry People newspaper was focused as much on the compensation that would have to be paid from the public rates purse, causing less funds to be available for development of roads and other infrastructure. And we also note that the print works were constantly being disrupted by police searches for seditious literature. With the demise of the Kerry Evening Post, there was no newspaper left in the county that was supportive of the establishment. So the less publication that took place, the less bad news was emerging about the authorities. And that's probably the attitude that they had at the time. When we get to November, the Stole races are proclaimed for the second year running. And the root cause of this ban goes back, as John O'Flaherty's History of the Stole races tells us, to Mickeen Downey and the riots that he caused during the meeting on the 10th of October 1917. Mickeen was ejected from Beechinner's public house, which is now the Mermaids, for drunkenness and general troublemaking. The RIC were called for, and while dragging a labouring Mickeen from the bar, the race crowd were returning from the meeting. Mickeen started shouting, "Up De Valera, up Sinn Féin, and to hell with the king," and struggling more and more to get free of the police. And seeing this, a number of racegoers who would have shared these political views, they determined to come to their fellow nationalists' aid. Now, ironically, Downey was a British soldier, home on leave, but this wasn't generally known to the crowd, and anti-establishment feeling was still running high around the county, as this was only a fortnight after the death of Thomas Ashe. We also note during this month there was tremendous interest shown in the hearing of the Stole quarter sessions of a malicious injuries claim brought by William J. McCarthy, who was the proprietor of the Central Hotel Ballybunion, in the amount of £1,500 for the malicious destruction by fire of the concert hall on the 1st of September. The McCarthy case was that, having allowed several Gaelic League events to be held in the hall, the authorities kept coming down on them for allowing seditious singing and statements to be made at events in the hall. And this led to McCarthy just refusing to allow the Gaelic League use of the hall at all for an event in late August 1919. And following that decision, several events there were disrupted by rowdy patrons and the spraying of red pepper in the hall, necessitating the early ending of dances and clearances of the hall. McCarthy claimed that these were acts of low-grade retaliation and that the eventual fire was a culmination of this policy of intimidation. Judge Drumgoole agreed with him, and he gave a verdict malice had indeed been proven and allowed damages of £1,720 out of an amended claim for £2,000. And as we pointed out earlier on, with Maurice Ryle's opinion about compensation claims, this was being levied off the rural district of Listowel, which meant less money for other important things to be done. And we come to December 1919. And back in July 1919, two men, Maurice Hunt, who was a tailor from Ballygarrett, Lixnaw, and Patrick Barry, a labourer also from Ballygarrett, they had been charged with posting notices on the 20th of July on the piers of the chapel at Irramore, threatening to take the life of Dr. John Halloran or of anyone who might have anything to do with him. The notices carried crude drawings of coffins and crossbones. Their case hearing was referred to the Munster Assizes and heard in Cork in December 1919. The justice read a portion of the notice to the court, and it said, "From this day forward, any person carrying on any dealings or assisting him in any way will not be safe, and it is only a matter of a short time when he will find himself incurable." Now, given the character references of the priest and Dr. Halloran, the justice felt it fair to deduce that Barry was led by Maurice Hunt, who was the instigator of the notice. For these reasons, he imposed a 3-month custodial sentence on Maurice Hunt and a 3-month suspended sentence on Patrick Barry. And Patrick Barry's sentence would not be officially recorded against him on production of a personal recognizance of £25 and a bond for good behaviour for 3 years. Now, it's worth noting, we also in Kerry Archives hold 2 similar fragments which were very kindly donated by Mary MacDonald of Ballyloughran. They also deal with Dr. Halloran and his fishery rights on the field. And while they report to be Captain Moonlight notices, it seems clear that they're of the same vintage as these Hunt Barry notices. For example, the first one says, "Dear Mr. O'Sullivan, please do not have anything to do with Dr. Halloran's fishery, or you will remember this warning given to you, until such time as he comes to terms with every tenant in Ballyhorgan. Do not mind him telling you or anybody he is doing so until you are quite certain he has done so. Do not interfere, or you will get plenty poorer and shot. Captain Moonlight." And the second fragment actually says, "It's well to let you know, my good man, that your moments are but few on this earth, so prepare for death. You're the father of a large family. You got a notice to this effect before to avoid Dr. Halloran's fishery. And that soul dammer of a brother of his has bought it from him now. So now you are getting this to prepare for the bullet at any time from the moment this reaches you. So this is the sort of low-grade intimidation that was going on at that time as well. We move ourselves into the next year. We're up to January 1920. Why is this thing still? I've gone too far now. Sorry. Yeah. Now, 1920 sees the first municipal elections in Kerry using proportional representation, and the introduction of this new PR voting system for local elections. This was, according to the Daily Mail, in an opinion piece, which also appeared in the Kerry Weekly Reporter, a work of stroke politics designed to stymie growth and support for Sinn Féin around the country. The paper noted that in January 1919, just a month after Sinn Féin had swept the boards in the general election, Sligo Town Council elections were held under PR, resulting in Sinn Féin gaining just 9 of the 24 seats. And the UK government instantly decided that PR would be applied to all future local elections in Ireland, and they enshrined it in the Local Government Act 1919. Now, in the event, Sinn Féin took 9 of 21 seats on Tralee Urban Council and 6 of 12 in both Killarney and Listowel. The first preference share in Killarney was 47.9%, but seemingly better vote management in Tralee turned a 35% first preference share into 43% of the seats. However, this may have had more to do with voters for big business candidates transferring either to no one or to random candidates. Now, due to a strong pre-election education campaign, the number of spoiled ballots was relatively small, being only 5% in Tralee and Killarney and just 1.5% in Listowel. The Labour movement fared very well in these elections as well, taking 5 seats in Tralee and Listowel, but just 3 in Killarney. And the business interest was rewarded with seats for Robert McCowan, Jeremiah McSweeney, James Slattery and John Latchford in Tralee, for Eugene O'Sullivan and James T. O'Connor in Killarney, and for Edward J. Gleeson in Listowel. And the Kerry Weekly Reporter, in rounding up the results, noted that this election had been delayed by 2 years on account of the war, and that the people had expressed an appetite for change from the old men who were too long in office and not doing their job. Now, if this was the expressed opinion, the voting pattern largely went against it, with 10 returning councillors out of the 13 who went for re-election in Tralee, 2 out of 3 re-elected in Listowel, and 5 of the 10 returning councillors re-elected in Killarney, which is hardly a resounding out with the old. You notice here as well a Christmas treat at Kilmorna House. This becomes quite poignant when we get to 1921, but I'll just read a portion of this. Though many of the old customs that prevailed in Ireland are gradually dying out or becoming memories of a hazy past, it is pleasing to record that one is still preserved, by which gentry and peasantry are linked together and united in bonds of respect that the convulsions of time cannot sunder. For the past half century, with a few unavoidable lapses, the gentry resident in Kilmorna House have maintained the grand old custom of giving a Christmas treat to the children of the surrounding peasantry. These social functions are looked forward to with delight by the little ones, who look on the bright side of events to gladden their young lives, and by the parents with admiring respect for the kindness shown their children. Well would it be for society at large were this charitable feeling more general, class distrust would cease, love would supplant hate, and a bond of mutual respect subsist, which would be the best guarantee for the welfare of all. It really tells us how valued some of the work being done by the so-called landlord class were, and it seems just so sad what happened just marginally a year and a quarter after this. The Sergeant Sullivan attack that's mentioned here. Sergeant Sullivan was a barrister who was representing the creamery interests that had been burnt at Kilquan and elsewhere, and he was attacked while he was at the home of the solicitor E.B. Slattery. He had just that day helped to secure a compensation of over £13,000 for James Slattery and Sons. January 1921 actually would provide an echo of this event, when 2 of the men who were involved in this attack, James Lean and Maurice Reedy, were killed by auxiliaries at Ballydwyer on New Year's Day. On the Thursday the 19th of February 1920, Camp Police Barracks was subjected to a sustained armed attack, and the assailants used hand grenades, rifles, revolvers and crowbars. Sergeant MacDonough and 6 constables defended the barracks, but the raiders succeeded in blowing up the end wall and called for the police to surrender. They refused and carried on returning rifle and grenade fire. The attackers later withdrew, leaving behind 2 guns, a Colt revolver and a couple of crowbars. Sergeant MacDonough was the only police casualty, having been shot through the cheek, wounded rather than killed. Now, telegraph and telephone wires were cut at both sides of the Tralee district, and roads were blocked with trees and other barricades. Military lorries were unable to proceed from Tralee to camp due to the road being torn up at Anna. Military lorries on the Ardfert Road were blocked by felled trees and telephone wires. They were prevented from offering relief to Ballyhaig Barracks, which they believed to be under attack as well. And once the Blennerville Road had been made passable, Sergeant MacDonough was transferred to the Tralee Military Hospital, where his wounds were found to be not life-threatening. The siege at Camp Barracks had lasted about 3 hours, and the authorities believed that some of the attackers had been injured, resulting in them abandoning weapons at the site. With so much confusion caused by downed telegraph and telephone lines, the military and police authorities in Tralee had no real idea as to where attacks on barracks were actually being made. This meant that they had to respond to reports coming from Abbeydorney, Ballyhaig and Camp, thereby splitting the forces available to answer any individual threat. The rumour mill in the town had it that 3 police had been killed at Ballyhaig and that a separate attack had been made on Abbeydorney Barracks. In both cases, no attack had taken place. Now, on the 28th of February, the Killarney Echo reported that 3 men were arrested and spirited away to Feenit to board a destroyer for an unknown destination. These were 3 of the men who were found to have been part of the attack on camp. Subsequent records indicate that they ended up in Wormwood Scrubs prison. And the 3 men, Patrick O'Shea from camp and Thomas Daly and Alexander O'Donnell from Castle Gregory, they were arrested following a series of house-to-house searches in which males were forced to strip naked for examination as to possible wounds. Now, in the middle of this slide, you can notice free foot examination. This is an advertisement for a visit on the 4th of March 1920 to Killarney by the world-renowned foot expert Dr. Shaw. And he spent the fair day, the 4th of March, in the Main Street premises of Mr. Charles Marr and Sons, ironmongers and general merchants, examining the feet of the local populace. But I can find no record as to what he made of the feet of the good people of Killarney and its environs. When we move to March, in the early hours of Saturday morning, the 20th of March, an armed party commandeered the houses of James Clark, Mr. Costello and Mr. Beasley, all situated directly across the road from Ballybunion RIC barracks. They sandbagged the window ledges and began a rifle and grenade siege onto the barracks that continued for some 3 hours. All the roads leading in from Listowel, Ballylongford and Tralee had either been blocked with felled trees or dug up to prevent the early arrival of reinforcements. Several of the usual occupants of the barracks were in Tralee on assize duty, leaving just 6 constables in the barracks. All sorts of wild rumors spread quickly about the nature of the engagement, with one report stating that one attacker who had been boring a hole in the barracks gable was blown up by a bomb thrown from an upstairs window by one of the police. Police sources stated that blood and brain matter were found on the street, but the attacker's body had been removed by his comrades. Now, this account was discounted because the nature of the stormy weather on the night would have meant that any such brain matter would have been washed away by daybreak. The police did, however, discover blood on one of the sandbags in the commandeered houses, and this may have brought about an end to the siege. For the following week, the police were active in their pursuit of any suspects in the case. This led them to the home of John Collins, Ballylongford, merchant and creamery owner, where Patrick Collins, his son, was arrested, and to Ballyduff, where 2 more men were arrested in connection with the Ballybunion attack. Patrick Collins was brought to Cork Prison, from where he was transferred to Belfast. He was released on parole on the 24th of April 1920, conditional on his returning to prison on the 7th of May, a period which was then extended by a further fortnight. The day after his return, he went on hunger strike and was removed to hospital on the order of the prison medical officer. The headlines for this month, they include rebel attacks on the Headford mail car, the Waterville police, the Lexnaw barracks, and on the Tralee Custom House. Also worthy of note were death threats which were made to Father William Ferris, and these were published in the paper. Father Ferris, who we know subsequently as the man who wrote the local history notes for the various parishes he was in, including Rathmore, Ballymckelligot, and Alliheath. Now, Father Ferris, as the paper said, he was one of the most patriotic and popular priests of the diocese, and he had received a threatening notice which read, "To those that encourage crime and murder and are responsible for it in God's sight, beware, for the Black Hand has come to avenge all murders, and you are a marked man. Your time may not be far off, so prepare to meet your God." And that's the level of discourse from, as they call themselves, the Black Hand. When we get into May, we see more threats against priests. Father Curtin from Ballybunion, and also Dr. J.D. O'Connell, the solicitor, who was formerly Austin Stack's boss. He too receives a death threat, again because he is a Republican solicitor and defendant of various Sinn Féin suspects over the years. There's also a note there, a death of an RIC Sergeant McKenna near Listowel. So things are actually starting to ramp up fairly seriously in terms of coverage of wartime events. And also worth noting there, Castle Island policeman resigns. This is one of the first notices we see of mass resignations that end up occurring from the RIC during the War of Independence. When we get into June, then you can see lots of headlines there for raids on Coast Guard stations, including Ventry and Feenet. The rifle range at Ballydunlee, which is just down the road from me here, was also destroyed. And also police attacks on police barrack at Feenet, a 2-hour battle there. And also quite tellingly, Austin Stack and Jack McKenna are banned under law from serving in high office. This basically means that because they're in prison, Jack McKenna, who had been appointed as the chairman of the county council, he's not allowed to be such because he's in prison. And Austin Stack, who had been voted in as the chairman of Tralee and Dingle Light Railway, is not allowed to hold that position by virtue of the fact that he's in prison. So they use the rules to suit themselves. It's also quite interesting, the top story here, Cromwellian cannon stolen from Ross Castle. They weren't actually stolen. The authorities actually removed these 6 cannon from Ross Castle. And again, even though they were Cromwellian in age, the authorities did not want them falling into rebel hands in case they somehow managed to get them in working order again. So they're taking no chances at this particular point. And when we get into July, again, another Maurice Ryle joint. His editorial of the 17th of July, it noted the appointment of a new assizes judge in the county, and he was unimpressed. He basically said, would it not be in the interests of public decency if someone besides Judge William Moore were sent to Kerry to lecture the people on their criminality? This High Court judge is or was one of Carson's chief covenanters, and it was to that fact and not to legal ability that he owed his promotion. Carsonism has been the cause, the provocative cause, of all the trouble in Ireland in recent years. Its aiders and abettors are primarily responsible for the present condition of things. For one of them to come to the south then and deliver homilies on lawlessness is about one of the greatest pieces of unblushing impudence that could be perpetrated. Satan reproving sin is alone comparable with it. Now, when it came to opening the assizes, Mr. Justice Moore noted that there were 138 cases as against 77 in the previous summer assizes. He said that there were 3 cases of murder of Crown servants and another since his report had been compiled, whereby a constable had been hurried to his maker by a bomb thrown into his bedroom. There were 2 additional domestic homicide cases, 1 of infanticide, 24 cases of wounding, 50 of arson, 7 of maiming of cattle, 2 explosions, 43 malicious injuries, 20 robberies of arms, 20 assaults on houses and firing into them. All in all, he described it as a melancholy record. He went on to report that 25 police barracks, 3 courthouses and 4 Coast Guard stations were among the buildings burned down in the preceding term. 6 police patrols had also been attacked and the public intimidated into refusing information on attacks to the authorities. He said that the one bright spot in the whole thing was the courage and fidelity of those who in these difficult times of danger and stress were serving in the forces of the Crown, soldiers and police. Now on Tuesday, the 20th of July, Tralee was thrown into confusion in the early afternoon when motor lorries of armed military and police and an armoured military car rushed through the streets of the town towards the Great Southern and Western Railway Station. They were hurrying to the scene of what the Kerry people described as a most daring and successful descent on a party of 11 armed soldiers at the North Kerry platform. These soldiers were charged with guarding coal and military stores at the station and were based in a carriage at the siding. As the Fianna train slowed down at the station, a large armed party jumped out, held up the military, and in less than a minute had seized their rifles and ammunition and disappeared. Now, the military were on the scene in less than 15 minutes, but the attackers had already gotten clear with their prize. Despite this, the soldiers fired some shots at the scene, forcing people to flee the station, and the Kerry People reports few were intrepid enough to go near the precincts of the railway for a while later. The Kerry Weekly Reporter stated that several houses in Rock Street were entered and the occupants roughed up by soldiers and police. And later in the evening, the police had arrested 3 youngsters from Rock Street: Willie Kelly, a 15-year-old, Dan Horgan, 16, and Dennis Spillane, 15, as well as 14-year-old Jim O'Connor from Dawson's Terrace. Just take in anyone. It really didn't matter. They just had to have something to show for all the hassle that they'd been put to. In August 1920, the Kerry Weekly Reporter noted that on the night of Saturday the 7th, the people of Tralee were terrorised by the extraordinary conduct of the police and military, the former being largely composed of what had been locally termed the Black and Tans. The police and military took to the streets at about 11 p.m. and without provocation started firing shots in the main streets, causing a state of terror which lasted for a couple of hours. Local Sinn Féin volunteers had seen to it that the streets in town were disturbance-free in the preceding nights, and on this occasion they'd been patrolling the licensed premises to ensure that they were closed at the proper time. While inspecting the bar at the County Kerry Club, a telephone call to the barracks resulted in that premises being surrounded by police and military, 2 Sinn Féin volunteers being arrested, and indiscriminate shooting in the streets by the police. The alarm was continued into the following day when 2 explosions were heard near the police barracks yard as people were returning from evening devotions. The paper says, a dance got up for a charitable purpose at the Foresters' Hall, Tralee, was only poorly attended, as girls naturally became alarmed, and many people feared that there would be a repetition of the previous night's terrorism. Now, the Kerry Weekly Reporter of the 14th of August 1920 was to prove to be the last issue of that paper and its sister paper, the Killarney Echo. The third paper in the stable, the Kerry News, was put out of commission at the same time, but it did reappear 3.5 years later on the 21st of April 1924. Now, just as it happened the previous Saturday evening, on Saturday the 14th of August, it saw a great deal of trouble on Tralee streets. Early in the evening, a 4-man police patrol had been attacked between Tralee and Abbeydorney, with 2 constables being wounded. Later on, towards midnight, a quantity of military property stored in wagons at the Great Southern Railway Depot in Tralee was destroyed by fire. What followed drove the people into a regular state of panic, according to the Kerryman. Shots were discharged and many fled the town centre in fear. Between 1 and 2 in the morning, flames were seen in the sky above Russell Street and found to be coming from Quinnell's printworks. It was reported that the town night watchmen were prevented from getting to the scene by auxiliaries, with shots fired over their heads. By the time the town hose was deployed, it was too late to save Quinnell's premises, so the focus was on saving adjoining buildings: Dennis Nolan's bacon and egg store and Mrs. Hayes' straw and hay shed. This was successfully achieved, despite Nolan's roof being seen to have caught fire. On the following morning, the smouldering ruins showed Quinnell's to be a complete wreck. All the machinery was totally destroyed. Now, Dennis Nolan paid tribute to the volunteers who had worked so hard to save what could be saved from his stores, as well as the heavy steel safe from Quinnell's. And John B. Quinnell noted that his losses would have been far greater if that item had not been retrieved, as it contained all of his business books. And he put it down to the courage of his works manager, Thomas Lynch, that the safe was retrieved. Now, Lynch would, in 1928, become one of the founders of the Kerry Champion newspaper, which ran from 1928 to 58. When we move into September for the first time, we see an unwillingness on the part of the British to repatriate the remains of Roger Casement, and this was to become a theme for 46 more years. So they started as they meant to go on. It also saw the conclusion of the inquest into the death of Patrick Kennedy of Aunaskal. And the jury found that Kennedy had been killed by a British soldier without cause, provocation, or justification. And the inquest jury demanded that the arrest and trial of the soldier who fired the fatal shot, as well as an investigation into the conduct of the officers under whose control the soldier was acting. And I'm almost pleased to say that in the middle of all that, the shocking assault in Tralee that you see on the screen, it's just a good old-fashioned domestic between two housewives brandishing sharp objects. So it wasn't all about the war. When we get to October, as well as reports on raids on Dingle and Aunaskal, we also see hunger strikers are beginning to die. Michael Fitzgerald was the first to go, but it wasn't long before Terence McSweeney would follow by the end of the month. And it's also worth noting that reports of some Kerry events carry a heading "From Cork Examiner." Now, this provided local newspapers with a means of beating the rulings of the local county press censor. So when they were held up in terms of telling a full story in the Kerry newspapers, they just bought in the agency material from Cork, where the Cork press censor had no interest in what was happening in Kerry, so he censored very little Kerry news. So we got proper Kerry news back in through the back door. We get to November 1920 and things get very hairy. What seems like a new idea, journalists embedded in security force details, it was believed to have happened in Kerry in November 1920. Official sources stated that a press party, including several photographers and a journalist of the Yorkshire Post, a Mr. Clifford Hutchinson, had toured in Kerry. The Belfast Telegraph stated that this tour was occasioned by a suggestion from various English cinema agencies who had written to the authorities asking permission to document the daily lives of RIC members in disturbed areas. Now, official reports of the incidents that occurred between Castle Island and Tralee on the 12th of November 1920 labelled it as an ambush by a party of 70 Republicans. The Yorkshire Post account, Mr. Clifford Hutchinson, he said that there were between 200 and 300 members of the Republican Army shooting from the creamery and nearby homes. And this report states that the cinema operator calmly produced his camera amid the strife and took an excellent film depicting the fighting. Now, what this report does not say is that the incident resulted in the deaths of the sub-manager of the creamery, Mr. Herlihy, and a 32-year-old farmer from Ballydwyer, John McMahon. The cause of death given for McMahon was shot dead by auxiliary police while running for safety. All other reports paint a different story to the official line of events at Ballydwyer. Locals stated that Herlihy and McMahon were told to run and gunned down as they did. Mr. Byrne, the creamery manager, on informing the authorities of his identity, was told that he was the man they were looking for. He was also told to run, but he refused. It was the intention of the authorities to present this event as a propaganda success for the auxiliaries, the foiling of a major ambush, but their fake film presentation, the Battle of Tralee, was almost immediately identified as such. The street lamps visible in the film were only to be found on Vico Road, Dalkey, and most definitely not in rural Kerry. Questions to the Chief Secretary in the House of Commons centred on who was responsible for the release of official anti-Irish propagandism in the press, who sanctioned the issue of a photograph entitled "From the Kerry Front After the Battle of Tralee, Grim Reality," whether the Chief Secretary was aware that the scene was Dalkey and not Kerry, whether he could state if a government armoured car and personnel had been lent for the purpose of making this propaganda picture, and what he intended to do about it. He didn't say much. On the 9th of November 1920, Constables Archibald Turner and James Woods were shot as they disembarked from a train at Ballybrack Station, about 3 miles south of Farranfore. Turner died instantly, but Constable Woods died 5 days later in Killarney. The auxiliary response was instant and lethal. On the following day, 21-year-old Francis Hoffman of Powlawadra was killed near his home. Uniformed men held him up, asked his name, and when he provided it, was told, "You are the man we want." He was placed against the fence and was shot. In other related events, men and women were beaten by uniformed men with rifle butts near Ballyfinane Creamery. Farmhouses and hay and corn stores were burnt, and a young shop assistant was beaten up as he went aboard a train from Ballybrack. Strike and reprisal provided the rhythm of November 1920. The auxiliaries reacted with ferocity to any action against them or the regular police. Frank Hoffman, Ballydwyer and other such events were a direct result of the Ballybrack shootings. The siege of Tralee was brought about by the kidnapping of 2 policemen, and events in Kerry were mirrored in many other parts of the country. The burning of Cork, the execution of Kevin Barry, Bloody Sunday, which was itself an act of reprisal, all ensured that November 1920 would go down as one of Ireland's darkest times. We move to December. The Tralee Liberator of the 4th of December reported that a detachment of uniformed men had arrived in Carrickaveen on the 26th of November and spent the evening parading the streets, entering premises and ordering that shopfront fascia boards written in Irish be taken down. At about 8:30 p.m, the plate glass windows of premises on Main Street began to be destroyed by these same men. The Irish House was particularly targeted. The wire guard screens were ripped off, thrown on the pavement, and the plate glass window broken. The railway bar next door was similarly treated, the shutters used as weapons of destruction to its neighbours' windows. Windows of the drapery shop at the Royal Hotel were also smashed and drapery goods stolen but recovered shortly afterwards. The arrival of regular police and army put an end to this destructive spree by the auxiliaries. The Liberator of the 7th of December 1920 reported that in Tralee, Mr. Talbot's premises in Nelson Street were visited by the RIC, and he was ordered to remove the Gaelic version of his name on the fascia board. The cooperative store in the square and Mr. Healy's licensed premises in Castle Street were also forced to remove Irish fascia boards. In Killorglin, Mr. P. O'Reilly in Langford Street and Mr. P.T. O'Sullivan were also requested by the police to remove Irish names from their storefronts. In Killarney, a wave of window breaking by auxiliaries, 5 or 6 uniformed men, resulted in, according to the Kerry People's Killarney correspondent, nearly all the windows in the town being smashed. He continued, to be precise, the windows of 57 houses, including those of the principal shopkeepers, were broken by men alleged to be in uniform. Back in Tralee on the 7th of December at about 7:30 p.m, it was reported that auxiliaries were subjecting townspeople to rough treatment, beatings with rifle butts. Their victims included an ex-sergeant of the King's Regiment. Other people were forced to their knees to swear allegiance to the King using a Bible. The Kerry People reported that a number of Lancashire Fusiliers coming on the scene tried to stop the punishment, but they were unsuccessful. At the picture drum, the audience was also forced to cheer for King George, and public houses were also raided in further acts of intimidation. General Macready, the Commander-in-Chief Crown Forces in Ireland, had declared a state of martial law in 4 Munster counties, that's Cork, Tipperary, Limerick and Kerry. And on the 12th of December 1920, he issued his first proclamation, laying down the terms to be followed by all law-abiding citizens and outlining the result of non-compliance with the terms imposed, in all cases death. The proclamation directed that all arms, explosives and ammunition in the hands of any person not in His Majesty's Armed Forces or not held under permit were to be surrendered before the 27th of December. Anyone found to be in contravention of the order would be liable to court-martial and, on conviction, a death sentence. As well as this, unauthorised wearing or even possession of a uniform would leave the person liable to penal servitude. The Listowel area started 1921 as it had ended the previous year, with military authorities showing their presence at a card game in Bedford, leading to the wounding of Patrick White and Edward Barrett as they ran across a field to avoid being taken by the military on the 1st of January 1921. At the same time in Dublin, 17-year-old Listowel boy John Lawler, who was the son of parish clerk David Lawler, he was killed by uniformed men. His death was certified as being the result of a blow between the right eye and right ear, which led to compression and hemorrhage on the brain. A fortnight later, on the 16th of January 1921, a party of RIC, 2 sergeants and 8 constables, were ambushed at Ballygrennan, just outside Listowel. The attackers used bombs and rifles, and 2 constables were injured, but this attack was surpassed on the 20th of January when District Inspector Tobias O'Sullivan was shot dead in Church Street, about 60 yards from the police barracks. The killing was the work of a lone assailant who stepped out of a house on Church Street and fired 3 revolver shots into the district inspector, who was at the time walking with his 5-year-old son. Before he died, D.I. O'Sullivan was moved into the grocery premises of William Toomey, and he stated that he did not think his assailant was from Listowel. District Inspector O'Sullivan had been a very popular presence in Listowel, and his death was denounced from the pulpit by parish priest, the very Reverend Canon O'Connor, and the other clergy at town masses the following Sunday. Now, also at this time, Father Ferris is receiving more death threats. This time he receives one on 22nd of January 1921 from anti-Sinn Féin quarters. We are hereby informed you are a member of that murderous gang called Sinn Féin. We do inform you, you are on our list for execution, so prepare to meet your God. You give no time for preparation, but we do. So you may repent of the seed of wickedness you have sown throughout Ireland, and you, priests, are responsible for every murder in God's sight. So God help you. And separately, Father Ferris received another letter the following day saying, Dear Father Ferris, owing to the threatening letter which appeared about you in yesterday's Liberator, I suggest that you leave Ireland and go to the United States or Australia without delay. And it's signed, An Earnest Friend. Now, we also note as well that in papers in 1921, you're starting to see lists of what they call IRA resignations appearing in the papers as well. These were provided by official sources, these lists, for publication as a propaganda counterbalance to the reports of mass RIC resignations. And declarations made by individuals under police duress these people often hadn't even been members of the IRA up to that point, at least. They may well have joined afterwards. So it was really a self-defeating thing. So we move on to February 1921. And the first thing we see here, first arms execution. This is following a military court trial at Cork on the 17th of January. Cornelius Murphy of Ballydaly, Rathmore. He was found guilty of offences against martial law, namely that he was in possession of arms and ammunition, a loaded revolver, on the 4th of January 1921. In finding Murphy guilty, the prosecutors noted that all correct procedures were in place for the defendant to be aware of the crime being committed by being in possession of an illegal firearm. A sentence of death by firing squad was imposed. And under a headline, Civilized Nations Should Take Note, the Irish Independent wrote, Cornelius Murphy was tried by a military court a fortnight ago, but the first intimation the public received of the sentence was the announcement that Murphy had been shot dead yesterday morning. The martial law regulations provide that the extreme penalty may be imposed for the possession of arms, but it was never believed that the death sentence would be carried out in a case where the accused was not even charged with having fired on Crown forces. And the Irish Independent also contrasted Murphy's treatment with that of W.J. Smith, who was charged with being in possession of a rifle and 17 rounds of ammunition at Dungannon. Smith was the son of a special constable, and he wasn't even detained in custody after trial by a field general court-martial at Derry. Or the case of J.M.B. Wilson, an ex-officer of Iona Park, Dublin, who was charged with possession of a revolver and ammunition. He was fined £5, or in default of payment, a 2-month term in prison. Long way short of death. Sir John Simon, a former Attorney General, weighed in on the subject. He said, the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act 1920 only conferred on courts martial the power to try civilians for crimes existing under the ordinary law and to sentence offenders to the same punishment as the law prescribed. If the military authorities are entitled to define new offences and to attach to them the death penalty, then this is certainly a situation which has not existed in the British Isles since the Petition of Right nearly 300 years ago. It seems to me a very serious question indeed whether the military authorities in Ireland can define new grounds for capital punishment, and if they have no power to do it, it is so to be hoped that their claim will be challenged at once before the High Court in Dublin. In other stories, the 8th of February 1921, Crown Forces arrested Robert Brown at Knockalocka. Now, Brown's house at Ballymakelligot had only recently been burned, and his brother John had been killed in 1918 in the attack on Gortaclay police hut. Robert's body was found some time after his arrest in Knockalocka Bog, with gunshots through his chest and abdomen. A military court of inquiry was held on the 2nd of March 1921. It concluded that the cause of death was shock and hemorrhage due to gunshot wounds in the chest and abdomen inflicted by some person or persons unknown. Now, given the timeline of Brown's arrest and the discovery of his body, it seems fair to state that he was murdered by the gang who picked him up in the first place by the roadside. The military court findings did not appear in any of the local or national newspapers at the time, and were only referenced in the civil death record for Robert Brown. In March, we had two of the largest engagements of the whole War of Independence. At Headford, a combined group of IRA volunteers from Ballymakelligot under Tom McEllistrom and East Kerry under Dan Allman hatched a plan to ambush a train en route from Kenmare to Tralee. Allman and volunteer Jim Bailey died in the attack, as did 3 civilians. The official GHQ statement on the ambush said that no arms or equipment were lost by the troops. The casualties were 1 officer and 6 other ranks killed, 12 other ranks wounded. It is believed a number of casualties were inflicted on the ambushers, and the dead body of one of them was found by the troops. Participants on the Republican side always questioned these figures, pointing to the fact that there were 12 military coffins used at Killarney just a few days after the ambush. So 7 dead, 12 coffins, doesn't quite tally. On the day after Headford, news reached Tralee of an attack on a military detachment near Lisbole. The first Dublin Castle report of the ambush stated that a police patrol consisting of a district inspector, Captain Hamilton, a Sergeant Kelly, and 9 constables was ambushed at 3 o'clock on Tuesday at Lisbole by about 200 men armed with service rifles, shotguns, revolvers, and bombs. After a fight lasting 3 hours, the attackers were completely routed. They are known to have suffered heavy casualties, which are estimated at about 8 killed and 20 wounded. The police captured 6 rifles, 5 shotguns, 3 revolvers, bombs, and a large quantity of equipment and ammunition. 4 of the police were wounded, but not seriously. The attackers carried away their casualties with them. Now, it appears likely that the police had indeed become aware of a plan to ambush them and arrived ahead of their due date. As stated in official reports, the IRA did take their casualties away with them, and Maurice Fitzgerald died of a perforated intestine and acute peritonitis a day later. Thomas Ashe died at Acres and was buried secretly at Ballynacorty and later reinterred at Kinnaird. Tommy Hawley from Tralee was carried across the mountains with a gunshot wound to the head, but he died of his wounds some 6 weeks later at Glentonassic. On Good Friday, the auxiliaries arrested William Sonny McCarthy of Lixnaw. McCarthy was an organiser for the Kerry Farmers Association, as well as working as a volunteer intelligence officer for North Kerry. He had just arrived by train in Tralee from Dublin, where he was instantly recognised by the auxiliaries and arrested. Now, after questioning at the RIC barracks on High Street, he was brought on foot to the Green on Saturday, 26th of March. According to official sources, he was being transferred to Ballymullen Jail. The official account goes on to state that the police party was fired on in the Green, and in the confusion, McCarthy was shot while trying to escape. Now, this version is very difficult to accept, particularly given that the police just left his body at the site for others to find, rather than making sure that he was dead. They already knew he was dead, but we've gone a long ways past that. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. On the 6th of April, 1921, Jack O'Mahony, who was a 58-year-old ex-soldier and shoemaker, he was killed and his body was found on a laneway near Rahunan. He'd been shot through the head and chest, and a sign reading, "Spies Beware, shot by the IRA," was found next to his body. On the 21st of April, another ex-soldier, Dennis O'Loughlin, aged 47, was also shot through the head and chest in Knightley's Bar on Castle Street. The Kerry People reported that it is stated that he had for some time been acting as a cook in the auxiliary barracks in Tralee. On the same evening in Barrack Lane, Tralee, a cattle dealer from Lusk, County Dublin, named Patrick Joseph Bell, aged 25, was shot by the auxiliaries. Now, Bell had been on his way back to his hotel and he failed to respond to a Crown patrol, which then shot him in the thigh. This wound turned septic, his leg was amputated, but he died a few days later. By way of retaliation for O'Loughlin's death, the auxiliaries imposed a 9 p.m. curfew, bombed Knightley's Bar and several other houses and shops, and made numerous arrests, including those of the 3 sons of Mr. William Knightley. And further afield, on the 14th of April, Sir Arthur Vickers was murdered at Kilmorna House, and a tag attached to his body read, "Traitors beware, we never forget, IRA." Kilmorna House was also burnt to the ground at this time. On Friday the 15th of April, 32-year-old Major John Alistair McKinnon, the officer commanding of H Company RIC Auxiliary Division, was shot dead as he played golf on the Tralee Golf Course at Ballybeggin. Now, Major McKinnon had been based in Tralee since the formation of H Company in October 1920 and had, as OC, overseen a great many of the atrocities carried out by the auxiliaries in North Kerry since then. The Major's last words have often been recorded as being to burn Ballymacilligat, and whether or not this was the case, Ballymac did get severely hit in the aftermath of his death. The presbytery at Clogher, where the parish priest and curate resided, was burned, along with several other houses and farm buildings. On the following Monday, the 18th of April, it was Tralee's turn to take the brunt of auxiliary fire. And as the Kerry People reports, bomb explosions resounded after midnight throughout the town, while many houses were attacked and people remained in their homes all night in fear and trembling. While the following morning revealed that no one had been killed, Mrs. Nolan and her child had a narrow escape when a bomb exploded in the sitting room of her house on Pembroke Street. Now, the Kerry People noted that 9 houses were attacked by bombs, including the Widow Vales in Boherbee, Costello and Flathead Publicans Boherbee, Kirby and Brosnan's Drapery on the Mall, Galvin's General Store in Bridge Street, the Railway Hotel in Ash Street, and Charles Nolan's cycle shop and his nearby home on Pembroke Street. But most crucially, the offices of the Kerryman and the Liberator on Edward Street suffered extensive damage when a bomb was thrown through the front door. After it had exploded, armed men entered and smashed up the print machinery, making publication impossible. And as I mentioned earlier, these papers didn't return again until August 1923. And in a final insult, the figure of the pikeman was pulled from the pedestal in the 1798 memorial and smashed up. Within 2 days of each other, 2 RIC head constables had been killed in Kerry. Head Constable Story in Castle Island and Head Constable Benson in Tralee. The Black and Tans were in the mood for revenge, and a perfect opportunity arose on the 12th of May 1921, when 4 members of the North Kerry Flying Column were surprised by a Black and Tan patrol at Gortaglana Bridge. The Flying Column was on downtime as some of the men recovered from illness associated with the unhygienic conditions that they were often forced to live under, and these 4 had met up by accident and were just chatting when they were met by the patrol. They were Condé from Ballyline East, a farmer's son, Paddy Walsh from Coulard, a farmer's son, Paddy Dalton from Athay, a hardware shop assistant in Listowel, and Jeremiah Lyons of Dua, a shopkeeper and publican's son. They were searched for weapons, and finding none, the Tans began to question them about their comrades and about possible involvement in the killing of Sir Arthur Vickers. Of the 4 men, Condé was the only one to survive the ordeal, and he provided a visceral account of their treatment of him and his colleagues before the 3 others were put to death by the Tans. He later said that he had recognised Head Constable Smith from Listowel, a Constable Raymond, and another man in the uniform of a district inspector of constabulary. The Black and Tans claimed in a report by General Strickland on the 17th of May 1921 that they had been attacked by a force of up to 80 rebels who took flight once their leaders had been killed. The Tans reported that they had identified Lyons as the leader of the North Kerry Flying Column. Condé's account gives the lie to this version of events, as does the civil death record account for all 3 men. The registration of death for the 3 of them gives cause of death as shock and hemorrhage following gunshot wound in variously neck, chest and abdomen, and uses the word homicidal at the end. Now, the civil record states that the cause of death was certified by a military court of inquiry held on the 18th of May 1921. In the case of rebel deaths, it was never practiced to portray the cause as homicidal, unless there was no reasonable alternative. In this case, the authorities clearly saw no alternative to homicide characterization. In another story that happened there, it was quite a sad one, is the unfortunate death of a woman called Nora Conway of Caharina, Tralee, who was shot as she just looked out her doorway 10 minutes after curfew in the town. So a lot of unfortunate things happening as well as murder. When we get into June, we're starting to get towards the wind down of the whole war. But Ballyheigue Castle was burned. Now, this has often been characterised as something akin to Kilmorna, but there is a difference. Ballyheigue was burnt after the sale and removal of its contents by auction. Kilmorna was just burned, and nothing was allowed to get out. So there is a different characterization to be had with this. The one other interesting story in this is you notice there, the Sinn Féin boys. And this actual story is William Scanton, who was 53, an electrician. He was charged at Hounslow, London, with stealing a horse and van. And he stated in mitigation that Sinn Féin boys were after him and that he committed the theft in order to get away from them, which seems very odd. I mean, the notion that there are Sinn Féin guys running around Middlesex looking for someone like a 53-year-old electrician. So Sinn Féin were playing for everything is basically the bottom line of that. And when we eventually then get to the tail end, and one of the last attacks on the police took place on the 3rd of July 1921 at Spunkhawn, way down south in Kerry, and eight policemen were ambushed. But we also then see peace prospects being declared by the Kerry people on the 9th, and then finally on the 16th of July, the Kerry people announces that the truce is in place. And as Maurice Ryle says, God grant that it may be the harbinger of an enduring peace in our long distracted country. Well, it was and it wasn't, I suppose, is the way of saying it, but it was at least that. In relation to the Kerry papers as it stood at that point, the Kerry People remained in circulation until August 1922. It returned again in January 1928 and ceased publication in March 1928. Maurice Ryle left then to go to Athlone to become editor of the Westmeath Independent, and didn't last long there. He died at the age of 67 in 1935. And curiously, his son, also Maurice, worked as a linotype operator for the Kerryman, and he too died in 1967 at the age of 67, just like his father. The Kerryman and the Liberator both returned in August 1923. The Liberator stayed going until 1939, after which it just disappeared and just became the Trilly edition of the Kerryman. And the Kerry News came back, the Quinnell flagship paper, on the 21st of April 1924, but it came back with a new banner. It used to use a seated Britannia as its banner, but obviously in light of the way it had left the first time round, use of a phoenix from the flames seemed like a very apt way to have its banner. Unfortunately for it, John Bustede Quinnell died 1 week before it reopened, but he died in the knowledge that his paper was coming back. So there was at least some little bit of good news for him before he died. It had become part of the Kerryman group of newspapers by the time it actually ceased publication in June 1941. I don't make any mention here of the Kerry Champion, but again, it's a child, I suppose, of the War of Independence, but a slightly later child, but it served from 1928 to 1958. And Shin Shin, I would love to take any questions that you might have for me at this point.